I am Nicoletta Pireddu, the inaugural director of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative. I am so delighted that after many attempts, we have managed to launch this Faculty Work in Progress series. I really hope that this initiative will allow us to discover the current research activities of our humanities colleagues and to foster exchange of ideas in a friendly environment. Please spread the word, and definitely anybody is welcome to present their work. Whoever is interested in participating can contact me at any time, and we can coordinate and find a respondent as well. I wish to give a warm welcome to our first presenter in the series, Bradley Gorski. He holds a PhD from Columbia University with a specialization in late and post-Soviet literature and culture, and he joined the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures last year. Bradley has published on post-Soviet bestsellers, late Soviet hipsters, medieval festivals, and conservative aesthetics in today's Russia. He's also an active critic of contemporary Russian literature for journals like World Literature Today, Public Books, and the Russian Review. The topic of his talk today is the post-Soviet novel as world literature. It is part of his book Manuscript in Progress, titled Cultural Capitalism, Literature and Success After Socialism. It examines the changing technologies of literary creation, criticism, and consumption in post-Soviet Russia. I wish to thank Elliot Kolla for kindly agreeing to be our respondent today. Elliot Kolla is Chair and Associate Professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies. He is the author of the monograph Conflicted Antiquities, Egyptology, Egyptomania, Egyptian Modernity, 2007. And of essays on modern Arab literature, culture, and politics. He has translated works of contemporary Arabic literature and has authored the very successful Noir, Baghdad Central, 2014, and the prose poem We Are All Things, 2020. After Bradley's presentation, Elliot will offer his comments and engage in a conversation with Bradley. We will then open up the Q&A with the audience, and so feel free to write your questions using the Q&A function because the chat has been disabled. Last but not least, as you may have seen from the flyer that I circulated a few days ago, actually more than a week ago, we will soon have another Faculty Work in Progress presentation on Friday, November 19 at noon by Sarah Omar from the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies. So I will send out other announcements soon, and I hope you will be able to attend. Thank you very much for being with us. Now, Bradley, it's your turn.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicoletta. And first of all, I really just wanted to thank Nicoletta for organizing this, and even more in general for taking the lead on kickstarting this series and the Humanities Initiative in general. I can't wait to see what develops out of all of this and to see all the sort of great cross-pollinations across the humanities that are coming. And also big thanks to Elliot for agreeing to dive into this topic with me. Despite his many other obligations on campus, Elliot has been extremely generous with his time. And he even read the whole chapter on which today's presentation is based. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation there. And so in order to give Elliot enough time and to leave time for what I hope will be an engaging discussion afterwards, I'll try to be as brief as possible, but also kind of outline the major theses of the piece, understanding that most people didn't have an opportunity to read what was there. So let's see. I'm going to share my screen here. There you go. Does it look all right? Everybody can see this? Okay, great. So today's talk is called Post-Soviet Novel as World Literature. And this notion of world literature is a kind of way of imagining an interconnected and largely market-based global system of literary exchange has really gained traction in the humanities over the last few decades. But it's not often historicized, I found. So I was interested in this question, why now? Why world literature now? If you pick up any book on world literature, you'll find that their recent revival gained steam around the same time. So Emily Apter in Against World Literature, for instance, writes, quote, "World literature as a disciplinary rallying point of literary criticism and the academic humanities became increasingly prominent from the mid-90s on." She connects that timestamp to the journal World Literature Today and the publication of Pascal Casanova's landmark World Republic of Letters. Franco Moretti's 2000 article, Conjectures on World Literature, suggests, quote, "It's time we return to that old ambition of Weltliteratur. After all, the literature around us is now unmistakably a planetary system." Moretti declines, however, to specify what he means by now or how this unmistakable planetarization has come about. David Damrosch, writing in the 2010s, writes, "The cultural and political realignments of the past 2 decades have opened the field of world literature to an unprecedented, even vertiginous variety of authors and countries," without further elaboration of what those cultural and political realignments might have been. So Moretti's now, Damrosch's recent decades, and Apter's mid-90s on all refer to the same historical moment, a moment that, though curiously none of them mention it, was characterized more than anything else by the end of the Cold War and by the triumphalist promise of free markets, liberal democracy, and the New World Order. That promise, I think, is not hard to discern in the world literary paradigm. Indeed, that paradigm would not be possible without it. World literature is liberal, market-based, unipolar. It's even based on Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory in both Moretti's and Casanova's versions. Though all of the founders of this paradigm explicitly placed the rise of this unipolar market paradigm just at the moment that global socialism failed, and even in Moretti's article, he remarks in an aside that, quote, "The way we imagine comparative literature is a mirror of how we see the world." Nevertheless, none of them examine the political context that I would argue is the very condition of possibility for the creation of this paradigm. Acknowledged or not, then, world literature as a disciplinary paradigm seems possible only in a post-socialist world. It is predicated on the imagined frictionless exchange and political homogeneity of a globe deprived of its second world, bereft of political alternatives, and unquestionably in thrall to markets and their paradigms. In this sense, world literature is how we imagine literature after socialism has failed, or if you like, it is comparative literature at the end of history. So given all this, it's a little surprising that world literature as a paradigm has very little to say about the former second world. So I was wondering what happens when you actually trace the international circulation of post-Soviet authors. Do their trajectories reveal a sort of post-ideological market paradigm or something else? What I found is that the post-Soviet novel circulates in what is unmistakably a global capitalist system. But it is one that is energized by the very political antagonisms that the global market was supposed to overcome. So let me show you what I have in mind here. I'll look at 2 examples, Lyudmila Ulitskaya and Vladimir Sorokin, 2 very different authors, but 2 who perhaps better than any other circulate through world literary networks. Ulitskaya has been received abroad as a writer out of time, a, quote, female Chekhov, in the words of one German review, who keeps her distance, quote, not only from her characters, but also from her readers. Today's problems are not her subject. In her language, one can hardly tell when and from where the author writes. French critics largely agreed. Quote, far from the depressing or sensational stories that the other post-Soviet writers enjoy, Ulitskaya asks the reader to follow her along a path with characters who are not unrelated to Solzhenitsyn's Matryona, whose kindness makes the world go round. This is perhaps no surprise. Ulitskaya's works portray a late Soviet life in nostalgic tones. Her first novella, Sonyechka, for instance, follows the title character from her childhood before World War II to the late 1980s, hitting many of the familiar beats of late Soviet history. Sonyechka evacuates with her family during the war, where she meets a much older man, a repressed artist whom she marries and with whom she lives out the Stalin years in exile. During the thaw, the couple moves back to Moscow. His talent is recognized and his past is rehabilitated. He's awarded a real artist studio, and the couple begins to circulate in the world of late Soviet dissident bohemians so highly romanticized in the West. So given this, one can see why Ulitskaya's work might have been attractive to international audiences in post-Soviet Russia, in the post-Soviet years. She offers a vision of Soviet life centered on exactly the kinds of people Western audiences might like to believe populated the Soviet Union. That is, the intelligentsia immersed in the consumption and creation of great art. As David Damrosch reminds us, literature travels best when it, quote, conforms to the receiving country's image of what the foreign culture should be. Ulitskaya's works fit precisely this mold, as the US book jacket for The Big Green Tent, a later novel, 2010, makes explicit. Quote, the big green tent epitomizes what we think of when we imagine the classic Russian novel. The West had spent decades imagining a late Soviet intelligentsia culture much like the one that Ulitskaya depicts, only to have that image undermined by the mire of post-Soviet Russia. Ulitskaya provides a respite from the messiness of Cold War's aftermath and allows audiences to plunge back into the comfortable fictions of the past. Sonitchka won the Prix de Medici in France in 1993, and Ulitskaya was quickly offered a place in the inaugural class of the Villa Marguerite Yourcenar residency for European writers at Mont Noir in the north of France. The next year, she was invited to Cognac's annual Salon of European Literature, where she participated in panels such as The European Dream of Russia and Communist Past, Russian Future. The stereotypes evoked in these panels and in the coverage of the event, pictured here, suggest that post-Soviet Russian literature is seen as repeating many of the forms of Soviet literature. Ulitskaya's success abroad can be accounted for, at least in part, through her ability to fit into exactly this kind of Western nostalgia for the previous forms of culture. The formal qualities of her work, elegant prose, clear realism, kind characters, stand in stark contrast to most post-Soviet literature, and instead reminds readers of Chekhov, Solzhenitsyn, and other classics of Russian literature. Sergei Ushakin, an anthropologist, has argued that nostalgia can be understood as a, quote, longing for the positive structuring effects that old shapes could produce, even when they are not supported by their primary contexts. Ulitskaya's work invokes just such old shapes that allow audiences, especially those abroad, to give familiar structure to the unfamiliar post-Soviet world. And this kind of form of nostalgia goes far beyond Ulitskaya's works themselves and into Ulitskaya's public persona. After the annexation of Crimea in 2014, for instance, she gave a talk in Kiev, which she began by noting, quote, though we do not want to return to Soviet times, that is precisely what seems to be happening. Later that year, Masha Gessen profiled her in The New Yorker under the subtitle, One of Russia's Most Famous Writers Confronts the State. In a French interview a few years later, she was asked whether she was considered an enemy of the people. And she answered, yes, just like in the good old days. Her response carries a dual valence. On the one hand, the obvious sarcasm suggests that the good old days should not be understood as good at all. But on the other hand, through her response, Ulitskaya evokes the structural opposition between state and writer of those good old days. She reminds readers and herself of the cultural power of the Soviet era opposition and employs it to fuel her post-Soviet circulation. So now I'll move on to Vladimir Sorokin, who's a very different writer. He does not offer his readers the comfort of nostalgia, but he too activates Soviet-era antagonisms to fuel his post-Soviet circulation. So in 1999, Sorokin published this book, Goluboya Sala, or Blue Lard, which includes, among other fantastical and conceptual elements, a very, very explicit sex scene between Stalin and Khrushchev in Russian. That scene, designed at least in part to provoke a scandal, did precisely that. So in the years after, a Kremlin-aligned youth group sued Sorokin and his publisher for libel against Stalin and Khrushchev. And on June 27th, 2002, that group, called Walking Together, constructed a papier-mâché toilet bowl in front of the Bolshoi Theater. in order to toss copies of blue lard into its tank. The action, which aimed to symbolically cleanse the public discourse of unwanted expression, seemed intended, at least in part, to resurrect Soviet-era modes of censorship, just as the ascendant Putin administration was trying to bring order to the chaotic post-Soviet years. The foreign press obliged. They responded just as if it was the 1970s. French, German, and English language periodicals reported breathless updates on the status of free speech in Putin's Russia. The difference from Soviet times, however, was that the same thing happened at home. Russian newspapers, both independent and state-owned, published regular updates. And Sorokin was introduced to a domestic non-literary audience for the first time. So far from banishing Sorokin to the margins, as Soviet censorship might have done in an earlier era, this scandal actually moved him to the very center of mainstream literary culture. The Russian Booker Prize, which is a whole nother story, even included Sorokin's following novel on its shortlist because, according to the jury chairman Vladimir Makhanin, quote, "In the current situation, this is the only way to protest against the suppression of an author and the threat of judicial violence." The language recalls a Soviet-era emphasis on supporting banned literature, usually in the West. Only now both the, quote, judicial violence and the, quote, protest come from within the same society, one part of which sought to resurrect Soviet-era control over the purity of Russian literature, while another aligned itself with global markets for culture. The same year, Sorokin was also invited to write a libretto for a new opera debuting at the Bolshoi Theater, the epicenter of Russian high culture. The opera was called Rosenthal's Children, and its plot repeated many of the same themes that stirred the controversies around blue lard. The Bolshoi could not have been happier with the opera, and especially with the scandal that it created. These are protests outside of the Bolshoi Theater on opening night. The year before, the theater had undertaken a new strategic plan designed to help it shed its conservative Soviet-era reputation. And Sorokin's new opera added the necessary avant-garde pique to its repertoire. When Read Russia, a new initiative, was launched in 2012 to promote Russian literature abroad, Sorokin was invited to participate in its debut campaign, Russia's Open Book. In 2015, Sorokin participated in the Venice Biennale, representing his fictional country, Teluria. Here he is. In order to take advantage, all of these initiatives required the cooperation of the Russian Ministry of Culture for them to be possible. So in order to take advantage of the symbolic capital of Russian literature, in other words, the post-Soviet state itself seems to be supporting its own opposition. Or seen from the other direction, the performance of literary repression on the part of state-adjacent bodies like the Youth Group, and of literary opposition on the part of authors and publishers, increases the circulation value of Russian literature and culture in both domestic and world networks. And the strategy seems to work. And it works not only at home, but also abroad. In the last month or so, 2 US publishers have announced a plan to publish more Sorokin than ever before in English. And their press release calls it, with a wink to the Soviet era, a, quote, 5-year plan for Vladimir Sorokin. This is Dalkey Archive Press and New York Review of Books Classics. So both of these examples, I think, Ulitskaya and Sorokin, show that post-Soviet literature participates in an unmistakably planetary and capitalist network of literature. But they also suggest that that network is not simply a global market, quote, freed from political constraints in which writers are bound to obey no other law than the law of literature, in Pascal Casanova's phrasing. World literature has not overcome politics. It has not left behind Cold War legacies. Instead, political antagonisms, in an uneasy alliance with capitalism itself, energize the very system of capitalist culture that was supposed to render those politics obsolete. So that's all I have, and I'll turn it over to Elliot, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bradley, for your presentation. And thank you also to Nicoletta for spurring on this event. It's great. I just want to say, as somebody who's been here at Georgetown for a while, it's really refreshing to have discussions where we meet and talk about ideas and research. So thank you to Bradley for sharing and Nicoletta for organizing. I really enjoyed reading, Bradley. I enjoyed reading this chapter. And it is deceptively bigger than, it's a big argument you're making, right? In the sense that you're engaging here in a critique of the discipline via an exploration of a literary situation or literary field that is usually not center in world literature discussions, right? So by bringing back the question of post-Soviet literature to that period of the late 1980s, early 1990s, right, and the marketization of the Soviet society and literature, you're able to then shed some really interesting light onto the discussions about world literature. And this is a big argument. So you make it look very easy, but I don't think it is, right? In the sense that you begin in this chapter by periodizing comparative literature's 25-year-old love affair with world literature. The dates might be very different authors' conceptions, right? And you're doing this by way of the specifics of the post-Soviet Russian literary case. And in that, you're masterfully putting Casanova, Moretti, Wallerstein, who I don't think Wallerstein ever asked to be conscripted into these debates, because by this time he's already moved on from them. And Damrosch and Apter, and you put them all in this very brilliant way early in this chapter, under the aegis, in an unexpected aegis of Fukuyama, by saying world literature is comparative literature at the end of history. And that's a big, interesting claim. And just as my first question to you, could you just unpack that a little bit? Like, what exactly how exactly do you intend to disrupt or intervene in the discussions about world literature?
Sorry, I muted myself for a second, but yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so this is interesting. I mean, anytime you have a sort of dominant paradigm in a discipline that's been going, for a couple of decades, you sort of start to get critiques and whiners about it, and I'm one of those whiners. But I think that one of the things that is interesting about this paradigm is that it assumes that world literature exists as a kind of default mode of global literary exchange that has come up at different times, and it is time to return to it. So all of these accounts of world literature usually go back to Goethe in I think 1816, when in his Conversations with Ackermann, where he describes world literature as this sort of new frontier. All European literature now needs to be not a national literature, but reaching towards a world literature. This moment comes directly after the Battle of Jena, which is a moment that Fukuyama also returns to in his End of History essay as well. And if you look at the sort of times when world literature historically and the discipline has become dominant, it is at these times of sort of globalization and desire for more sort of global connectedness. So that was kind of what interested me originally about this. And then looking at the sort of world literature, explorations of world literature, I was surprised at how little actually comes from the former Second World, not only the former Eastern Bloc, but even, explorations of things coming out of communist China, whether it's sort of post, 80s China or before that, but it's kind of world literature weirdly avoids these post-socialist areas. It has a way of accommodating post-colonial struggles for literary legitimacy. And I think that Casanova does this pretty masterfully, actually, in the second half of her book. But the post-socialist is kind of a unacknowledged but necessary condition for this paradigm to exist. So I was kind of curious about that, and the more that I dug into that, the more that I saw that I think one of the reasons why it is not often considered is because post-socialist literature still circulates based on these political antagonisms that don't sit well with post-socialist, or sorry, with world literature as a paradigm. And they do it deliberately, and they do it encouraged both by the receptive international audiences and by the sort of producing post-socialist authors and publishers. And so I wanted to sort of dig into that and try to figure out if there is a way to incorporate what is actually going on with post-socialist literature as it circulates into this paradigm, or if this kind of means that it might be time to move past this paradigm and think of something new.
I want to come back to that because I want to hear what the next paradigm would be. I'm at the age where I want to ask the kids what's coming next. But I want to stick for a sec with another the dynamic, which is the core the core theoretical discussion at the beginning of your chapter, which is really about the bifurcated field of literary production, right, between the samizdat and tamizdat, the locally produced, do-it-yourself or underground or self-publishing during the Soviet period, and the publishing abroad. And the question of the sociology of literature here is really, it seems really interesting, and I would like to kind of hook that back into the way you're trying to periodize world literature by tying it back to a materialist history in a way. But I want to kind of open up that question a little bit more, because that doesn't come out, didn't come out in the presentation, but it's there, it's a backbone in your chapter. And I really, really appreciated that. So if I understand it right, the Soviet field of literary production, so I'm going to just be taking clunky terms from Pierre Bourdieu's work, it's split into 3 dimensions or 3 sectors. Maybe one is maybe state publication, and then there's non-state publication, which is bifurcated by either a domestic, non-official, underground kind of production, the samizdat, and the foreign exilic production or production abroad in tamizdat literature. And so in the world that I work on, Cold War dynamics are only now just we're starting to make sense of them in modern Arabic literature. And so a lot of what I know is actually coming through that, because, the Arab world was also a place, was also a theater for the cultural Cold War. And here I'm invoking Francis Stoner Saunders' work in the cultural Cold War. But so if Bourdieu is describing a field of literary production that's bifurcated between or along an axis of market value versus aesthetic value, right? You're describing a much more complicated field of literary production where there's these different sectors that are, at least some of them are in opposition to one another. And so this is all Cold War, these are the Cold War dynamics. And in the Cold War dynamics, right, dissident status begins to have a literary value, especially in foreign markets. The more dissident a work is, the higher literary value it might come to have, and so on. And I was just wondering, what are the other axes? So that's the Cold War field of literary production. And your argument is that some of these dynamics persist even in the post-Soviet era, right? Whereas, and you just, in your presentation, you talked about how Sorokin and even Ulitskaya claimed this mantle of oppositional stance, and especially when presenting themselves to foreign audiences. What are the other axes of contradiction or conflict in this? If you were, in other words, it seems to me like you're using Bourdieu, but now in 3D. I just want to hear more. because it's really exciting.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is a great question, and something that I've sort of struggled with over the course of this project here is how applicable is Bourdieu to the late Soviet situation and into the post-Soviet era. Bourdieu is obviously operating on a relatively capitalist model, as many Marxists do. And he is sort of thinking about, as you said, this bifurcation between aesthetic value and commercial value in his view of the mostly 19th century French literary field. Notably, state power is largely absent from that, even though he sort of talks about the autonomy of the writer. It's usually the autonomy from commercial needs, and that writer then can use that autonomy as a political tool with the, as he mentions with the J'accuse example. But state power isn't there sort of directing the publishing process. And obviously that's very different in the Soviet Union. So in the Soviet Union, it's exactly right. There's sort of this bifurcation between official and unofficial literature. And we have to complicate that always because there were authors who were both officially published, but would also publish other things that they couldn't get published sort of unofficially underground in this samizdat way. And then the unofficial literature, is separated between this domestic and international sort of outlets, samizdat being self-publishing and tamizdat being publishing abroad. So one of the things that this does is it gives sort of a literary legitimacy to those who cannot publish officially. So if you've been rejected by state publishers, you can claim that as a mantle of heroic opposition to an unfair and unjust state, right? And people could do this even if they didn't have anything to show for it writing-wise. So people would write for the desk drawer, which is the sort of Soviet expression of it, writing so that they didn't want to publish at all. They would never submit it to a state publisher, but they're writing in this way that they knew would not be publishable. And for that reason, they sort of claim this mantle of heroic opposition to the state, even when they don't necessarily pursue publication in either one of these other ways. But what that also does is it forces writers into a necessarily political situation, right? If you want to publish with the Soviet Union tells you that all literature should be socialist literature, socialist realism. So you're making a political choice in that way. If you publish elsewhere, you're doing it with criminal liability. Either self-publishing within the Soviet Union or publishing without state permission abroad carries criminal charges in the Soviet Union. So you can't publish abroad without some sort of political implication. But, and this is where it kind of gets maybe 3-4 dimensional, in order for that publishing abroad to carry the literary meaning that those authors wanted it to, it was touted abroad as pure and disinterested aesthetic exploration. So it is really important, for instance, to take an example that most people have heard of, it is really important for when Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago was published abroad, for everybody to claim that that book was a literary book, not a political book. This is a great piece of Russian literature, and can you believe that the Soviet state will not publish this? But of course, it was published abroad as a political provocation. It was helped towards publication by the CIA, along with many other organizations from the West. And even if it wasn't helped by the CIA, by publishing it abroad, Pasternak knew he was doing something political. But in order for that political act to work, it needed to claim total political disinterestedness. So this kind of play on these two, these politics and anti-politics that really comes up in Cold War culture and Cold War aesthetics, I call these negative dependencies in the chapter. And one of the things I think that this sort of paradigm of world literature is supposed to overcome is those negative dependencies, right? And we're supposed to be able to return to something that is a little bit more recognizable as the Bourdieuian system, where we have commercial literature, avant-garde literature, but it is all as Casanova says, subject to nothing other than the laws of literature itself. However, these negative dependencies seem to continue, and they continue because people find them worthwhile. Both state power, publishers, authors, and audiences abroad find these sort of negative dependencies really useful. Who should we pay attention to coming out of China? Is it somebody like Ai Weiwei, who is opposing the state, or is it somebody who is, aligned with the state? Who should we pay attention to coming out of post-Soviet Russia, right? Is it somebody who stands up to Putin's annexation of Crimea, or is it somebody who goes along with it, is a cheerleader for it? And we like those sorting mechanisms as audiences, and we like to sort of think that we are reading the right thing. Even those of us who care deeply about the aesthetic value of the literature we're consuming. So I think that those political antagonisms continue, and I think that's an important part to kind of fold into our understanding of how literature circulates.
That is so interesting. This same anti-political politics is really characterized as a certain kind of literary modernism in the Arab world. That was developed. It was never a major strand, but it was definitely there and promoted by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and the CIA-backed journals in the Arab world. So we have, and it's very closely aligned to personalism in the Arab world. So as a philosophical position, and like one of the great Arabic literary masterpieces called Season of Migration to the North by Tayyib Saleh, like Dr. Zhivago, was published under the direct auspices of the CIA. So it's like interesting times. So, but that didn't persist. And what's interesting about the story you're telling is how some of these dynamics persist even after the Cold War. I wanted to remind everybody who's viewing this that we have a Q&A forum that you should be able to find right down at the bottom of your screen on the bar there, in case you have any questions for Bradley. I'll go and ask one more, but I hope somebody will have some other questions. So this is a chapter about novels. Let me ask the question real quickly, and then it looks like we've got a great one. I'll read off in just I'll read it, and while you're answering, Bradley, we'll come back to this. What about poetry or other literary arts? Are they marked by these same sort of dynamics that we see in Sorokin or Ulitskaya?
Yeah, that's a good question. To be brief so that we have time, yes, I think that they are. I think to a slightly different extent. In large part, this is about novels because novels translate better and circulate better abroad than poetry. But the sort of oppositional nature as an energizing force for the circulation of poets has definitely been a big factor, certainly since the 2011-2012 sort of protest movement against the Putin government. But even before that, and actually one of the sort of closing arguments of the book, which is about the sort of development of capitalism in post-Soviet Russian literature, is that poetic opposition is formulated. Poetic opposition come the sort of mid-2000s is formulated much more as anti-capitalist opposition than anti-state opposition. And so you get a lot of poets who are very interested in creating a poetry that is specifically resistant to capitalist modes of circulation. And so the sort of the negative dependency that is going on here is one that is sort of less about denying politics, but more about denying involvement in capitalist markets.
Very interesting. Here we have a question from Professor Fedorova. In your opinion, how do the paradoxical post-colonial qualities of post-Soviet literature, where on the one hand, the subjects of former republics functioned as subalterns to Russia as empire, and on the other hand, the whole post-Soviet space is often perceived as subaltern and the West as empire? So how does that correlate with the post-colonial aspects of world literature?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating question and obviously multi-layered. So The model of sort of post-colonial legitimacy in world literature, I think, was absolutely set by Pascal Casanova's book, where she talks about this sort of quest for legitimacy of authors from the former colonies, specifically in Paris. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that Casanova sets up her model of world literature as specifically unipolar. Everything is centered in Paris. And Russian literature has never been sort of imagined by its authors in that way. Russian literature has always been sort of centered in Russia, even as it expresses its inferiority complex towards European literatures, and specifically Paris. So you get a situation which I'm blanking on the scholar's name, but has been called nested colonialisms within Russia, where you have the peripheries of Russia trying to claim legitimacy in Moscow, Moscow asking for legitimacy often in Europe, but then that claim for legitimacy that tries to be gained in Europe is actually brought back to Moscow, brought back to Russia. So this actually comes through in some of the authors that I'm looking at here, both Ulitskaya and Sorokin. They are much more interested in their own legitimacy as Russian authors in the Russian publishing field than they are as sort of world authors. So I think this is a little bit different from the situation that Casanova talks about, where you have authors from the former French colonies trying to sort of claim a part of the world literary scene. I think Salman Rushdie, who she doesn't really talk about as much because she's more interested in French literature, but Salman Rushdie is a good example of this, right? Somebody from the peripheries of the British Empire, but really central to English language world literature. Russian authors are interested in gaining legitimacy by circulating abroad, but they're really interested in bringing that legitimacy back to Russia and being sort of the next great Russian author for Russian audiences. And I think that that's one way that this kind of interesting situation plays out a little bit differently than in the post-colonial situation elsewhere in the world.
Great, I think that does it for time. Nicoletta, why don't I hand it back to you?
Absolutely, 12:45 sharp. We didn't organize it so well, but you see, perfect. Unfortunately, it's time to close. I say unfortunately because there is so much that we could still ask Bradley and so much we could discuss. It's definitely a very fertile topic. And thank you, Elliot, for asking such enlightening questions. They allowed us to see connections also beyond the domain of Russian literature. It's precisely the scope that we want to reinforce, bridging boundaries and see connections with other areas of investigations. Fantastic debut of this faculty work in progress series. Thank you so much, Bradley and Elliot. Thank you, Candace, for your support. Thank you to our attendees. If you have any advice about the format for future events like this, if you think that the time is not enough or too long, the choice of the time in the days, the format, please be in touch. We want to make sure that we do something that is useful and pleasant to the community. So feel free to be in touch. And thank you again very much. I look forward to the next one, which will happen very soon. Thank you again for being with us.